Okay, let's unpack this. I saw this fact that honestly kind of blew my mind.
Oh, yeah. What's that?
That if you actually count all the private gardens, green space makes up something like, what, 60 to 70% of some UK cities?
Yeah, it's surprisingly high when you include domestic gardens.
Yeah.
Huge
It's
areas.
massive, isn't it?
Yeah.
So it makes you wonder, okay, if our cities are already that green, why does the whole conversation about sustainable cities seem so fixated on, building denser?
Uh-huh.
And often, let's face it, kind of shrinking those green bits in the process.
That is exactly the core tension, isn't it? It's this common idea, this assumption really, that more density just automatically equals sustainability.
Right, like it's the silver bullet.
Exactly. But, well, as we're going to dig into, the reality is just much more complex, much more nuanced than that.
So that's what this deep dive is about today.
Precisely. We're diving into the findings from the CityForm Consortium. That was a big collaboration, several UK universities involved, supported by different groups. And think of this as us trying to pull out the really crucial insights from their detailed research. They looked at what truly makes a city sustainable, going way beyond that simple, compact city good sprawl bad debate.
Yeah, cutting through the noise. Because look, we know you're busy, right? You're juggling work, maybe trying to keep up with your field, or maybe you just have this thirst for knowledge.
Mm-hmm.
So our mission here is basically to deliver the key stuff, the core takeaways from this research. They looked at how a city's physical shape, its form, the layout, buildings, green space,
All of it.
how that connects to sustainability, environmental, social, economic, the whole package.
And crucially, this wasn't just abstract theory. They looked really closely at 5 specific UK cities:
Which ones were they again?
Edinburgh, Glasgow, Leicester, Oxford, and Sheffield. So a pretty decent geographical spread in different types of cities, too.
So that gives us some really grounded, real-world perspectives.
Exactly. So the goal, our aim for this deep dive, is to really understand, based on this pretty hefty research, that intricate link between how our cities are designed, their physical form, and sustainability in that broader sense.
Okay.
We're going to look at the specific things they measured, the elements of urban form, and importantly, what the research actually found about their impact.
Okay, so let's start there then. When we say urban form, what key things were they measuring in this study?
Right. So they really broke it down into several core components. First was just land use. How is the land actually used across the city? Residential, commercial, industrial, parks, roads.
The basics.
The basics, yeah. Then density, which is a big one. They measure that in 2 main ways. Dwellings per hectare, so how many houses or flats in an area, and also people per hectare.
Okay, number of homes versus number of people. Makes sense.
Yeah. Then accessibility was another key factor. How good is the transport network? How easy is it to get around? How long do journeys take?
Crucial for daily life.
Absolutely. They also look closely at the buildings themselves, the housing mainly, but other buildings too. What type are they? How big? What condition are they in?
Right. Detached houses versus blocks of flats, old versus new.
Exactly. And finally, the actual layout, the pattern of the streets, the road networks, and linking back to your first point, how the green space is distributed. Is it one big park or lots of little bits?
So it's a really comprehensive picture they were trying to build, not just pinning it all on density.
Precisely. That's the key. They understood that all these things interact, they're interwoven. You can't just isolate one element.
And you mentioned density comparisons.
Uh-huh.
How did these UK cities stack up?
Yeah, this was fascinating. The average densities in the 5 UK cities they studied, they were sort of in the range of roughly 29 to 38 people per hectare.
Okay. Doesn't sound super high when you put it like that.
Well, exactly. When you compare that to many other European cities, they're often much denser. And then you look at some Asian cities, and densities can just skyrocket. Over 200 people per hectare isn't uncommon.
Wow. Okay, that really puts the UK context into perspective. We think of our cities as busy, but globally.
Globally, they're often at the lower end of the density scale, relatively speaking. It definitely makes you reconsider what we mean when we talk about a dense city here.
Totally changes the frame. So how on earth did they gather all this data? I mean, mapping land use, counting people, measuring travel times across 5 cities. Sounds like a monumental task.
It was it was a very comprehensive approach. They used a lot of GIS, geographic information systems.
The mapping software.
Exactly. That lets you analyze spatial data, layer it all up across the whole city, see the patterns. But importantly, they didn't just stay at that bird's eye view.
No.
No, they combined it with really detailed household questionnaires, going down to the individual level, asking people about their homes, their travel, their neighborhood experiences.
So mixing the big picture with the ground level reality.
Precisely. That combination of citywide GIS analysis and these, granular household surveys allowed them to build this really rich, multi-layered understanding of urban form and its potential impacts.
Okay, brilliant. So we get a handle on urban form and how they studied it. Let's dive into the environmental side then. That initial point about green space percentage really stuck with me. Does just having lots of green automatically mean a city is like ecologically top notch?
Right. Well, this is where it starts to get really interesting and maybe, yeah, a bit counterintuitive.
Uh-huh.
The research basically showed that the sheer amount of green space, it's not the only thing that matters, not by a long shot.
Okay.
They found that even in areas that had similar overall population densities, the actual ecological performance could be quite different.
Really? So you could have two equally dense areas, but one's doing much better environmentally.
Potentially, yes. So just looking at that headline percentage of green space on a map, it doesn't guarantee you've got a healthy, functioning urban ecosystem.
That is unexpected. So if it's not just the total amount, what else did they find was critical? What other factors play a big role?
Well, think about temperature regulation, for example. The urban heat island affects cities being hotter than the surrounding countryside.
Yeah, we all feel that in summer.
Definitely. The study confirmed, as you'd expect, the link between higher temperatures and lots of hard, impermeable surfaces, roads, pavements, roofs, that sort of thing.
Right. Less green, more concrete equals hotter.
Basically, yes. But they also found something quite interesting about housing types. Smaller homes, and especially multi-dwelling buildings like flats or terraced houses,
Uh-huh.
they tend to reduce the amount of energy needed per household for heating.
Because they share walls, less external surface area.
Exactly. So while a denser area obviously has more buildings overall packed in, the individual heating demand for each home might actually be lower compared to, say, lots of large, spread out detached houses.
That's a subtle but important point. It's not just density, but the type of density.
Precisely. The form of the buildings matters. And then there's water. How cities handle rainwater.
Yeah, all that concrete, the water's got nowhere to go, right? Creates runoff.
Huge amounts of runoff. And green space obviously helped soak that up. But the research here revealed something crucial. The relationship isn't linear.
What do you mean, not linear?
Well, as you pave over green space, yes, runoff increases. But, and this is the important bit, once you get down to very low levels of green cover, like in really, really dense areas, reducing the green space even further has a surprisingly small additional impact on runoff.
So those tiny pocket parks in ultra-dense zones might not be doing much for flood prevention.
They might not be doing as much as we think for water regulation, no. Aesthetically nice, perhaps, but their functional impact on runoff could be quite limited at that point. And, of course, all that water running off hard surfaces picks up pollutants.
Yeah, oil from roads, other nasties.
And carries them straight into rivers and streams. So it's not just having some green, it's about having enough of it and having it in the right places, configured effectively, to actually manage that water.
Right, so the pattern, the size, the location of green patches seem really critical for water management, maybe more so than just the overall percentage.
Yeah.
Okay, what about climate change? Carbon sequestration. Do our city trees and parks actually soak up much CO2?
They certainly contribute, yes. They mentioned Sheffield as an example. It's got about 15% tree cover, which is pretty good, and that definitely helps lock away carbon.
Okay.
But looking across all 5 cities, the general trend was fairly clear. More densely developed areas, they tended to have lower predicted rates of carbon sequestration.
Well, that makes sense. Fewer trees and plants overall.
It's logical, yeah. Less vegetation means less capacity to absorb CO2 from the atmosphere. So while urban green spaces are valuable, absolutely, relying on them to be major carbon sinks and really built up dense city centers might be, well, perhaps a bit unrealistic.
Okay, so denser usually equals less carbon capture potential.
Yeah.
Got it. Now, biodiversity, that's always a big part of environmental health. How does the way we build our cities affect the variety of plants and animals living alongside us?
This turned out to be one of the most complex areas they looked at. Really intricate findings.
Oh, so?
Take breeding birds, for instance. They found a negative relationship between housing density and the richness of bird species.
meaning fewer different types of birds in denser areas.
Exactly. Fewer species overall. But, and here's the abundance of birds. So the total number of individual birds you might see.
Yeah.
That showed a different pattern. It was more like a hump shape, peaking at medium densities.
Huh. So very dense areas might have fewer species, but medium density areas might actually have the most individual birds, even if they're common types.
That seems to be what the data suggested, yes. So very dense farms might not support a wide range of species, but they can still host quite large numbers of a few adaptable types, like pigeons or sparrows, perhaps. It really highlights how different urban forms can favor different ecological outcomes. There isn't one best density for all aspects of biodiversity.
That's a really subtle but important distinction to make.
Wow, absolutely. And it gets even more detailed than that. The research pointed out that different ecosystem functions, things like pollination or pest control or that water regulation we talked about, they seem to have different optimal arrangements of green space.
So what works best for encouraging bees might not be the best setup for managing stormwater.
Exactly. There are trade-offs. They also looked at plants, finding that generally more green space coverage meant more native plant species, which is usually seen as a good thing. But the richness of non-native plants followed a different, more complex pattern. And then you've got other environmental factors too, like noise pollution. That's another stressor. And it's pretty directly linked to the amount of traffic and therefore hard surfaces like roads.
Right? More roads, more cars, more noise.
So yeah, the environmental picture of open farm, it's definitely not black and white. It's more like a patchwork quilt. Different densities, different layouts have distinct ecological pros and, well, cons too.
Okay, so definitely not a simple case of green good, dense bad for the environment. Lots of interconnected things, lots of nuances. Let's pivot a bit now. What about the social side? Sustainability isn't just about the environment, it's about people, communities, how we live together. How does urban form impact that?
Right. This is where the research really started to challenge some of those, widely held beliefs, particularly about the social benefits automatically assumed for compact cities.
How so? What did they look at?
They looked at things like social equity, community spirit, how included people feel, social connections, cohesion, the glue that holds neighborhoods together.
Yeah.
And the findings were, well, quite surprising in some ways. After they controlled for other factors like people's income and background.
Yeah, the sociodemographics.
Exactly. They found that often it was the lower density, more suburban areas that actually scored better on things like residents feeling proud of their neighborhood, feeling attached to it.
Really? Better than denser areas.
Often, yes. And also higher scores for residential stability, people staying put longer, and just general satisfaction with their home and the immediate local area.
Wow. That really goes against the grain, doesn't it? The usual narrative is that density fosters community.
It does challenge that narrative quite directly. The assumption that just putting more people closer together automatically creates stronger social bonds. This research suggests it's not that simple. It seems that maybe that sense of having your own space, perhaps a bit more ownership in less dense areas, can actually foster strong local ties and pride.
Interesting. So why might that be? Why could lower density sometimes lead to, well, seemingly stronger social outcomes?
Well, the researchers floated a few ideas. Perhaps in less dense suburbs, residents feel a greater sense of kind of personal investment in their patch, their house, their garden, the street. That might translate into more local pride, maybe more effort to maintain the area, more informal interaction with immediate neighbors.
Okay, I can see that. What about just general social interaction, bumping into people?
On that front, their findings hinted that medium densities might actually be the sweet spot.
Not too sparse, not too crowded.
Kind of, yeah. Enough people around for chance encounters and a buzz, but perhaps not so many that it feels anonymous or overwhelming, where people just retreat into their private space.
That makes intuitive sense.
They also stress the importance of having easily accessible local services and amenities, even everyday places like the local supermarket or shops.
How do they fit in socially?
Well, they can become these informal social hubs, can't they? Places where people bump into neighbors, have a quick chat. Convenience and familiarity can really help build those casual connections that underpin a sense of community.
Right, the corner shop effect, almost. Now, what about those specific housing developments? The ones built to be super sustainable, with solar panels, rainwater harvesting, all over.
Ah, yes, the eco-homes, they looked into those too.
Did living there automatically make people live more sustainable lives overall?
This was another really revealing finding. It turns out not necessarily across the board.
Oh,
While the residents in these specially designed sustainable homes, they did tend to be more efficient inside their homes, using less energy, using less water, that sort of thing.
which you'd hope, given the design.
Exactly, the tech was working, but this efficiency didn't automatically translate into other sustainable behaviors,
Like what?
like their travel patterns, how much they recycled, how involved they were in local community activities. On those fronts, they weren't significantly different from national averages.
Huh. So the sustainable building didn't automatically create a fully sustainable lifestyle.
That's the takeaway, yeah. The physical infrastructure, the green design, it's important, but it doesn't guarantee sustainable behaviors in all aspects of life. Behavior change is complex.
It really is. So that links to travel then. There are often claims, aren't there, that certain neighborhood designs, well, high density, shops mixed with houses, grid street layouts, good public transport access, that these things will lead to people driving less.
Yes, those links are often made very strongly in planning policy.
Did the research back that up?
It found some evidence, yes. For example, moving to denser, mixed-use neighborhoods can influence whether people own a car. Maybe they feel they don't need one as much.
Okay, so some effect there.
But the crucial point they emphasized is that actually changing how people travel day to day, that's a much tougher nut to crack. It goes way beyond just the physical layout of the streets and buildings. Habits, cost, convenience, personal preference, they all play a huge role.
Right. You can lead a horse to water, but you can't make it take the bus, essentially.
Something like that, yes. Urban form is an influence, but maybe not the deciding factor for everyone's travel choices.
Okay, so social sustainability. It seems it's more about fostering that sense of connection, pride, stability, maybe access to local hubs, rather than just aiming for maximum density. Let's move on to the third pillar, the economic side. Money, viability, markets. How does urban form connect with all that?
Well, the research really frames urban form, the physical shape of the city, as an outcome, fundamentally, of how real estate markets work and where transport infrastructure gets built.
So the form follows the money and the roads.
To a large extent, yes. And density, coming back to that, is a key factor in whether certain services or public transport routes are economically viable. They simply need a critical mass of people in an area to make financial sense.
Right, you can't run a frequent bus service through a very sparsely populated area.
Exactly. The numbers just don't stack up.
Okay, and what about what people actually want to buy or rent? Do housing market preferences align with sustainability goals like density?
Well, not always. Their findings on what people actually preferred in terms of housing generally pointed towards lower density, suburban type living.
Still the dream for many, the house with a garden.
It seems so, yes. And these preferences are often strongly linked to the life cycle stage. Younger people might want to be central, near the buzz, but families often prioritize space, schools, maybe a garden, which tends to push them towards the suburbs.
Okay.
And interestingly, when they looked at what makes a new housing development financially viable for developers, the actual density of the neighborhood had a relatively minor influence compared to other big factors,
Like what?
like overall house prices in the area, and critically, how accessible the location is, transport links, proximity to jobs and amenities.
So developers are driven more by price and access than by a desire to build densely for its own sake.
That's what the evidence suggested. Market forces, in many cases, still seem to pull towards less dense forms of development, despite all the policy talk favoring density for sustainability.
So the market and sustainability goals aren't always pulling in the same direction. What about the basic costs of just running a city? Providing the pipes, the roads, the power lines? Is sprawl more expensive than compact development?
That's the conventional wisdom, and there's truth to it. Infrastructure costs are definitely linked to density, and particularly the total length of the networks needed: roads, pipes, cables.
More spread out means more miles of pipes and roads to lay and maintain.
Generally, yes. The study did show variations in these infrastructure costs across the different neighborhoods they analyzed. Lower density areas tend to require more road length per person, for example, which obviously has implications for long-term maintenance budgets.
Right.
However, there's another economic angle too. They also found that residents, perhaps unsurprisingly, really value having amenities, shops, cafes, services within easy walking distance.
Which is easier to provide economically in denser areas.
It can be, yes. It affects the viability of local businesses. So, there are economic arguments and trade-offs associated with both dense and more sprawling patterns. It's not entirely one-sided.
Okay, so economic pluses and minuses, depending on the form. Now, this research, it wasn't just academic navel-gazing, was it? It was meant to be useful, to inform how we actually shape cities going forward.
Absolutely. A major goal was practical application.
So how do they see these findings being used? How can we translate this complex picture into making better decisions for future development?
Well, one key aim was to try and develop potential thresholds, maybe even target values
Okay.
for some of these urban form characteristics, density, green space provision, accessibility that could help guide development towards more sustainable outcomes.
Like benchmarks almost.
Sort of, yeah. But importantly, tailored benchmarks. They gave an example of applying this thinking in the Drummoyne area of Glasgow.
Okay, what do they suggest there?
Based on their analysis, they suggested that increasing density, but specifically along the main public transport corridors and perhaps creating some new, smaller neighborhood centers with local services, could significantly improve the sustainability performance of that specific area.
Ah, so not a blanket rule, but a targeted intervention based on the local context.
Exactly that. It highlights the need for bespoke solutions. What works in Drummoyne might not be the right answer for a different part of Glasgow, let alone Sheffield or Oxford.
So it really pushes back against those simple universal planning rules.
It really does. They were quite critical, actually, pointing out that a lot of the commonly recommended values you see in sustainable urbanism guidelines, they often lack strong empirical evidence to back them up,
Really?
particularly when it comes to the social dimension. There's a real gap, they argued, in understanding what kinds of urban form, what densities or layouts actually support positive social outcomes. We just don't have clear social thresholds defined.
That's a huge gap.
It is. So the big takeaway, the main conclusion from all this work was pretty clear. There are no simple one-size-fits-all rules for designing a sustainable city.
No magic formula.
Definitely not. Policies have to be smart, they have to be context-specific, they need to carefully consider the trade-offs between different types of urban form and balance them against the local socioeconomic reality. Urban form does matter, its influence is real, but it's often subtle, and its importance can sometimes be overstated compared to other massive factors like economic trends or, crucially, individual behavior and choices.
Wow. Okay. This has been, well, genuinely fascinating, a really deep dive into something incredibly complex. Just to kind of wrap things up, thinking back over everything, what were maybe one or two of the most surprising or perhaps counterintuitive findings for you personally from this research?
Good question. For me, I think, firstly, the sheer complexity of that density ecology link. The idea that just hitting a green space target doesn't guarantee ecological health, that was quite striking.
Yeah, that was eye-opening.
Secondly, those findings about the potential social benefits, pride, stability, satisfaction, sometimes being stronger in lower density suburban areas. That really challenges the standard compact city is always socially better narrative.
It certainly does.
And thirdly, perhaps, the finding about the sustainable housing developments, how the sustainable design influenced energy and water use in the home, which is great, but didn't necessarily spill over into changing travel or community engagement habits.
Right. The limits of physical determinism.
Exactly. It just really hammers home that creating truly sustainable cities is about so much more than just the physical bricks and mortar or the layout of the streets.
Absolutely. Which leads perfectly, I think, to a final thought for you, to the listener, to maybe chew on. Given all these complexities, all these trade-offs we've talked about between environment, society, economy, different densities, different layouts,
Yeah.
how do we move beyond those overly simplistic policies? How can we actually create cities that are sustainable, yes, but also genuinely livable? Cities that balance all these competing needs effectively.
And adding to that, what role do we play as individuals? Our choices, our behaviors, how much do they shape whether these grand urban planning ideas actually succeed or fail on the ground?
Those are really big, critical questions, aren't they?
They are. And maybe, take these ideas and look at your own neighborhood through this lens. How do these factors, density, green space, access, community feel, play out where you live?
Yeah, become an urban detective in your own area.
Why not? And if something sparked your interest, maybe look up your local council's planning department or search for resources on sustainable urban development, see what's happening locally.
Because ultimately, becoming well-informed, staying informed, It's not a one-off thing, is it? It's an ongoing process.
Definitely.
But hopefully, this deep dive today has given you a really valuable framework, some new ways to think about the challenges, and also well, the exciting opportunities as we all try to figure out how to build better, more sustainable urban futures.